everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all, and today we are following up on our previous discussion about ADHD and BDSM. In that one, I discussed some of my top tips for supporting someone with ADHD within a kink relationship, but ADHD is far from the only kind of neurodivergence you'll find within our community. At least if you're going from personal experience, it seems that there are a lot of neurodivergent folks of all stripes within the kink world. Like, a lot. And making that video got my wheels turning. Is that actually true? Are neurodivergent people attracted to the BDSM community or kink activities? And if they are, why is that? Do we know? In order to find answers to these questions, I decided to look into the scientific literature about this. It is still very much an emerging field, but I was pleasantly surprised to find several recent studies looking at the correlation between kink and neurodivergence. So, let's talk about them. And to begin with, I want to define what neurodivergence is because I don't want to presume that everyone knows. And basically, neurodivergence is defined differently depending on where you look, but it is largely understood to refer to an umbrella of conditions and structural brain differences that lead to someone to have different brain functionality than the norm. In simpler terms, it's someone whose brain works differently. That is who a neurodivergent person is. This term is most commonly associated with ADHD and autism, but it can also include people with TBIs, OCD, Tourette syndrome, and dyslexia, and so on. I've also seen people include conditions such as anxiety, PTSD, CPTSD, and depression, and personality disorders under this umbrella as well, but this seems to be a little bit more of a controversial inclusion. For our purposes today, though, we'll just be focusing on ADHD and autism because frankly, those were really the only two I found any kind of research about at all, and also we haven't really talked about those before on the channel very much. We have done a little bit on like mental health and BDSM, but that's about all we've touched on that's anywhere close to this. So, in any case, most of the earlier studies on this subject that I found focused more on hypersexuality and paraphilic behavior, rather than participation in consensual kink relationships or in the community. And by early, I mean like less than 10 years ago. That is still how new a lot of this stuff is. But one of the first I found was from a group of German researchers who looked at just under 100 people with ASD, the clinical term for autism spectrum disorders. They found that ASD men reported a greater level of sexual desire than non-ASD men and were more likely to meet the threshold for hypersexuality, defined as excessive and uncontrollable sexual fantasies, urges, and behaviors accompanied by significant personal distress and adverse consequences. ASD men reported more sadistic, masochistic, and voyeuristic fantasies and behavior than non-ASD men, and also had more exhibitionistic and frotteristic fantasies as well. However, exhibitionistic behaviors were at nearly the same level as non-ASD men. Specifically, 28.6% of ASD men reported having sadistic behaviors, and the same amount also reported having masochistic behaviors. A whopping 42.9% reported having sadistic fantasies, closely followed by 39.3% for masochistic fantasies. Voyeuristic fantasies were also reported by 39.3% of ASD study participants. Women with ASD were strikingly similar to their non-ASD counterparts, actually reporting far fewer masochistic behaviors in proportion to the frequency of masochistic fantasies. I can't find an English copy of the questionnaire they used for this portion of the research, the QSEB, but it's important to specify that they were looking at clinical paraphilic conditions, which may not reflect how we understand consensual BDSM at a socio-cultural level within our own community, and it's clearly not including all different types of potential BDSM behaviors. That being said, this study does seem to suggest that autistic people, especially men, have a tendency towards some of the most common elements under the BDSM umbrella. Supporting these findings, an article published in Aut, the Journal of Autistic Culture, authored by Ariel E. Pilskin, referred to another survey, which found that 5.7% of people who identified defined as BDSM practitioners had an autism diagnosis, compared to just about 1% of the general population. And by the way, that article is probably the most comprehensive source we have looking at BDSM and neurodivergence. I use their sources a lot when making this video, and if you'd like a deeper look, I recommend giving it a read. But in any case, while these are small numbers in absolute terms, it means that within the BDSM community, autism may be over 5 times as common as in other places. I think this may explain why it may feel to neurotypicals, i.e. people that are not neurodivergent, that everyone in the BDSM community is on the autism spectrum. That's obviously not really the case, but when it is just so much higher than in the general population, it can certainly feel like it's everyone when you notice it is so much more common. But 5.7% may actually be a low number, considering how many people, especially in marginalized groups, are not tested in childhood and never receive a formal diagnosis. And that leads me to perhaps the most shocking finding I found in the research. A 2023 study of 413 puppy players showed that a whopping 1 in 2 scored at or above the threshold for potentially having autism, compared to just 1 in 44 of the general population. This study gave participants the Autism Spectrum Quotient Short Form, or AQS, assessment, rather than merely asking if they'd ever had a formal autism diagnosis. So it's naturally going to catch far, far more people that way. To quote the study, approximately 35.4%, 146 out of 413, of the sample scored above the stringent cutoff of 70 or above. 55.7%, 230, scored at or above the most lenient cutoff of 65. As I am not a researcher or someone trained in assessment questionnaires, I don't know if the AQS is totally accurate or not, but at minimum, seeing that over 35% of puppy players are at or above the threshold for autism is extremely interesting and something I would absolutely want to be studied further. Is it something about puppy play specifically? The online community attracting a certain sort of person? Some mysterious third thing? I am dying to know. If you repeated this study with Shibari practitioners or Littles or ABDLs, would you get similar findings? Because honestly, if we're looking at bondage, I'd expect the numbers to be potentially higher than in puppy play. Many autistic people self-report that they find comfort in tight, compressing stimuli, and what is bondage if not a bonding, intimate form of that kind of thing? The same article I referenced earlier highlights that there may be a correlation. According to a study they cite, bondage and restraint were the most important parts of BDSM for the average autistic respondent, whereas non-autistic respondents cited commands and demands as the most important. So hey, if someone wants a free survey idea, how about looking at bondage and autism a little bit more closely? But autism is not the only form of neurodivergence. So, what about ADHD, the other big type of neurodivergence people speculate may be correlated with an interest in BDSM? While there aren't many studies looking directly at a correlation between an interest in BDSM and ADHD, surprisingly enough, studies on the sex lives of folks with ADHD suggest that they are prone to impulsive, high-risk sexual behavior, especially women with ADHD. While obviously kink is more than just a high-risk sexual behavior, I could see there being some overlap, like spontaneously deciding to engage in choking during sex without having a conversation about it beforehand, doing bondage at somebody's house alone right after meeting them on a first date, doing something you saw on a show without doing any further research. I've gotten at least a couple of horror stories from the impulse-prone women in my life along these lines before. After all, not all kink happens at big fancy dungeons. As we've talked about before while looking at other research, the vast majority of people who ever do kink occasionally are doing so in private. Only a slim percentage ever make it out to public events on a regular basis or make it a part of their identity or their life. So spontaneous private play wouldn't be shocking for me to hear about, and that is almost always more risky than carefully planned public play. Other studies on ADHD have suggested that the correlation is not with high-risk sexual activity in people who have ADHD in adulthood, but with subclinical hypersexuality. People with ADHD, like others with clinical or subclinical hypersexuality, may use sex as a way to cope with negative emotions, only for it to then lead to shame, distress, and other life consequences. While there's no direct line that I'm aware of between hypersexuality and BDSM, I could see people similarly turning to BDSM as a coping mechanism because that's widely accepted as being a common occurrence, at least based on anecdotes within the community. Sadly, though, this is the most relevant research I could find on ADHD and BDSM. There does appear to be a sexologist who is working on a study specifically looking at BDSM, ADHD, and heterosexual women, precisely because the research is so limited right now, and I'm excited to see what is found when the study does get published. And lest anyone think that study design is somehow sexist for only focusing on women, according to the researcher, they only did it that way because the existing literature is so paltry that they have to be careful to control for as many variables as possible. They really see this as just like a starting point and want to expand it in the future. And so, that is the research we have for right now. It seems very likely to me that neurodivergent people are in fact overrepresented in kink compared to the general population. It's really just a matter of how much. But the natural follow-up question to that is, why? I found less research investigating why neurodivergent people may be drawn to BDSM, but theories abound within the lifestyle. Some say it's natural that autistic people might gravitate to kink because of the structure of our community and our norms, the emphasis on explicit, specific communication before, during, and after an experience, the use of unambiguous safe words, encouraging people to place limits on what they do and do not want without judgment, allowance for and acceptance of non-normative experiences of intimacy and relationships, romance, and sexuality. Because BDSM exists outside of the mainstream, our norms have to be taught explicitly in a way that isn't typical of vanilla sexuality or relationships, so that means not having to guess as much at like what a rule book would be for all of this. After a lifetime of guessing what the so-called obvious social norms are, I imagine having them laid out directly and without judgment is a big relief. And of course, because BDSM can be a source of lifelong learning and exploration, it can be a positive connection-building special interest. I've seen many an ADHD having top turn their rope bondage practice into a hyperfixation too. Folks with ADHD may also enjoy BDSM because they may appreciate the rules and structure of a DS relationship. And because there are so many kinks out there, there's always a new one to jump to if something loses their attention. It's a pretty big sandbox to play in without things getting boring or stale. And one big theory I've heard amongst people I know personally with ADHD is that BDSM gives them a way to get the intense stimulation they need in order to feel satisfied. The idea being that because of how their brain chemistry works, they need more potent stimuli to stay focused and satisfied with, let's say, partnered activities. Anecdotally, many of the autistic women I know feel specific comfort in the BDSM community because of their frequently atypical relationship to sexuality, which may not match with the stereotypical non-autistic vanilla vision of femininity. BDSM can be a way of bucking the traditional social scripts around sex and relationships for people of all genders, and may be another way in which neurodivergent people reject established social norms. Other studies have suggested autistic people exist slightly more commonly at the extremes of sexuality than non-autistic people do, with more identifying as asexual or hypersexual than the rest of the population. An asexual autistic person may find BDSM as a wonderful tool for getting their intimacy needs met without having to have sex, which is true in general for kinky aces, just for the record, but I can see that especially being a motivator there as well. And let's not ignore the fact that the modern pansexual BDSM community started on the early internet. That's also exactly the kind of space neurodivergent people would have been drawn to, just as they were drawn to hacker, geek, and sci-fi culture. It may not even be the case that neurodivergent people had just happened to fit in here, but that neurodivergent people created the space. They've always been here. It doesn't just accommodate them, it's theirs. They help to make it. To quote from the book Unmasking Autism, which one of my viewers recently recommended to me, quote, "When autistic people are at the reins of event planning, we can craft environments, such as BDSM gatherings, that are tailored to our sensory and social needs. In small, mask-free subcultures that are created and maintained by autistic people, we get a glimpse of what a society that truly accepts neurodiversity might look like." Which I think isn't only true, but also a beautiful message. And certainly I think one factor here as well with the BDSM community is that it could be a space where, because autistic people feel like they're amongst similar-minded folks or other autistic people, it could be an area where they feel like they don't have to mask as often or as much or even at all. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, and I hope that is at least something that people have the opportunity to get to. Of course, with the BDSM community, it's not even really just like one community. Like, we do have some overall themes and norms that we generally share, but the scene in one city or one country or even like one side of a city is not going to be the same as the other places around the world, other cities, other states, other countries. And so it's hard to make generalized statements, but I think by and large, this could be the kind of place where neurodivergent people feel more accepted, which could also draw them in. And yeah, so it was really fascinating to me to see that there wasn't that much research. Like, I don't know why, I just assumed that ADHD and autism, especially ADHD, is so common and is such a talked about topic, at least, from what I perceive compared to BDSM, that I just assumed that there was going to be more research looking at the sex lives of people who are neurodivergent, and there's not really that much, even if sex research on the whole is increasing and is focusing more and more beyond just like, how do we get people to not have ED anymore, which is like, how do we make it so people have babies the most effectively? Like, used to be, that was the realm of research that we really stuck in, and now we've moved beyond just looking at paraphilias and baby making, and maybe consider other factors for why people might want to know about that stuff. So I'm very interested to see where all this ends up going in the next 2 to 5 years, if we get more research, if the studies that people seemingly want to be doing ever actually end up getting made. And, I think at least if the question is, are there really more neurodivergent people in BDSM? The answer seems to be pretty resoundingly yes, but now it's a question of why. And we've seen studies understanding and trying to understand why people are motivated for BDSM before, but we haven't looked specifically at neurodivergent people. I think that could be a really interesting area of research for someone to get into if they, again, want a free thesis study idea. If they're looking for novel research, that's a pretty good one to go for, I think, especially if you're in this community. But that is about that on that, y'all. I was really excited to look into this. Hopefully y'all enjoyed it as well. I like making these kind of sciencey, researchy videos because, who else on the internet is going to talk about this stuff? It's probably mostly just going to be me. Thank you all so much for watching this one. Let me know your thoughts, comments, and questions down below. If you did enjoy this and are ready, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all different kink and BDSM related topics, including scientific research, polyamory, relationship advice, and so much more. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way is with Patreon. Link to that will be down below. If you do already support me there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.